So according to the time, I think I have to sit right here, right? Because I've only got a few minutes left. First of all, hello to everyone. Thank you for inviting me here. Truth be told, I feel uncomfortable because Amos said it's very important to talk about this, but I don't feel comfortable talking about Iran. And after I saw Amos's presentations, I feel even less comfortable because of all these concepts that I know from different places. But I think that the discussion is important, and I think it's gone beyond certain points that maybe it shouldn't have gone to. I think Israel has many ways to show that it is serious about what it says and what it keeps saying. And perhaps we should have not said some of those things we said. I think that in some of the places it did not contribute to our interests. I don't want to repeat everything that's been said, but I want to say that as far as I'm concerned, and that's what I thought also as in my capacity as the chief of the IDF General Staff, and I want to remind you that who was the head of my security at the time. Is it true? Is it right for Israel to live under an Iranian nuclear umbrella? I think we shouldn't. And in my profession, you cannot deliberate and you cannot hesitate, because you have to take action and you have to decide your position. And that's another question I ask Dagan. At the end of the day, if nothing works, the Iranians will have a bomb. So that's the question. And I think that there's no disagreement or no dispute that if it is solved another way, whether by sanctions or any other way, then we'll be happy. But the questions that the Israeli leaders have to cope with is what happens if it doesn't. And also, in light of, even if we don't go into the differences between the various options, will we pass the problem on to somebody else for them to deal with it? So I think the strategy that is right and that is preferable and that caters to the Israeli interests is anything that we have been reading about in the covert campaign. If we understand that this is just in order to buy time, and no more than that, and it should be supported by the sanctions, whether financially or politically, and above all, we should have the option to use the military force reliably and available force. And I think that without these three factors, it will be very difficult to deal with this problem. I also agree that there is some extent, in my opinion, my professional opinion, until a year and a half ago I also saw the materials and could assess according to them. I think there is some exaggeration in the terms of the Iranian response, things we can live with, because if you take this equation, we don't talk about what happens after the bomb. We're talking about what happens beforehand, but we don't talk about what happens afterwards. And say tomorrow we have a Iranian nuclear umbrella, we have another dispute with Hamas or with Hezbollah. What will this dispute look like, and can Israel live with such a change? And I think the answer is no. But I also think that we're not going to have a picnic, but we don't have to exaggerate or overestimate what the response will be, not from Iran, that we don't have a partner in, and not in terms of Hamas or Hezbollah, because we may be meeting them along the way as partners. And I'm not even talking about the developments that have been happening over the 18 months that have advantages and disadvantages, but I do agree with Dagan's analysis that with Bashar al-Assad, if his regime is toppled, even if a radical Islamic regime replaces it, or any other, it will be a problem for Nasrallah, who will not have an easier time when Bashar al-Assad is no longer there. He will have to make calculations, and it'll also go into the consideration of the Iranian response. So I have no doubt that the preferred course of action is to try and exhaust the alternatives of what people call soft power, which is sanctions. I'm not sure it'll work, I'm not sure it'll help, but I do know that the Iranians are not oblivious of the prices they are paying, and I think that it's an intelligence fact that is known to everyone in this room that is not unprecedented either. The Iranians, even in light of Bush's statement, President Bush's statement in 2003, that they are invading Iraq, already. It's not a matter of assessment. They didn't want to be the next target. So if we have some sort of suspicion, and as far as our friends, the Americans, we've spoken to them about it a lot, that we ask ourselves whether it's not too late. In English I always said whether it's not too late and too light. And really maybe these sanctions, they could have been started beforehand, they could have been imposed earlier. And sometimes the suspicion rises when you know that there are decisions on Capitol Hill in the Congress, and some of the considerations that you hear from the administration is that there is impact, or what sort of impact it will have on the quality of life, and in terms of election and so forth, and this doesn't contribute to Israel's security in terms of yes, and I think that in terms of the political and security goals, we may not have the intimacy of the discourse to understand it better. I don't want to be judgmental, but I do think that this option has not been exhausted. At the same time, Israel cannot give up on the military option, and therefore we thought we should present it to the political echelon and give them the possibility. I want to say one more thing about the time aspect, because I think it is important. I think we still have time. I think others might think differently, but it's important to exhaust every other way before we pull out the military option. I think we still have time. There is still time for diplomacy. And I don't think that we have exhausted every other step, and Israel should focus on convincing the West and the international community and the Americans of more creative ideas as to how all the levers can be put into action. And I think the Americans can also tell themselves that they have exhausted every other option before they have resorted to the military action. I don't think we have a risk here other than the strategy that Amos has spoken about, Amos Yadlin has spoken about, is if it won't be dangerous to say, and I will risk it and say and assess with the knowledge in the international community, the knowledge that they have and the intelligence community, I think we will be able to identify this breakout, and I think we'll have enough time to take care of it, and the legitimacy will of course rise, because if the Iranians will change the rules of the game tomorrow, then it'll put to the test all the statements we have said, and we will have better knowledge of where everyone is standing, and that is the greatest risk we are currently taking. And aside from that, we're not taking any risks if we exhaust all the other options. I think that we could have taken action earlier. I remember that in 2009 I met Susan Rice, who is the US ambassador to the UN, and she led the campaign of the sanctions, and I think she did a wonderful work. I remember that the Russians were even supportive of her and of the sanctions, and there are many other steps that can be taken bilaterally between countries. The Americans are doing quite a lot these days, and you can do even more. And here there is quite a lot of difference between the rhetoric and the reality. If you look at the foreign commerce balances when countries talking about Iran, some are very loud when they're talking about Iran, and they are still having commercial contacts with Iran. So they're talking about how important the sanctions are, but Europe and some countries are still having very high commercial contacts with Iran. So I think we still have a way to go, and we still have time for the issue of before we reach the junction where we have to decide to use the military action. And I also agree with Amos Yadlin's bottom line that the basic assumption for this discussion is that Israel cannot allow Iran to have a nuclear bomb, and therefore we need a covert campaign and everything to do with the efforts and the sanctions, and to save this military option for later, and to convince the world that it's a regional problem and not just an Israeli problem, and to prepare ourselves for the possibility that the sanctions will not help. And I think that is the best strategy, and the most important one. I think another thing that is important to understand is that although Israel has the reputation for having nuclear plans, this is not an operation. I think using the word campaign is the right word, because a campaign is not only military, it's also political, and it's before and after, pre and post, and throughout. And here you can still also look at both sides of the story. You can't promise to have an achievement. Even in the past we couldn't, and I was part of the discussions on Iraq, and we asked ourselves what would happen after we attack. And somebody even asked what would happen if the French, if you remember, they provided them with the nuclear plant, and we didn't know what would happen with the French. And we asked ourselves whether we could tolerate this. And yet Israel decided to strike, decided not to allow Iraq to have nuclear power, and then you keep having to consider the alternative. And those who are dealing and engaging in this issue know that they can't reach a conclusion if they don't clearly analyze what maybe is missing from our discussion, and that is what happens once we have a bomb. Once Iran has a bomb, has the capacity, has the capability, the nuclear capability. And to me it's clear that in terms of prices, even if you don't agree with the assessment, and it's not that high, I don't want to mislead you, but it's not just an operation. But again, it's not as if the whole Middle East will be set on fire. I don't think Iran has the interest to do that. I think it's a choice between two very uncomfortable, very bad options, but if we're asked what endangers Israel more, then obviously the first option is more dangerous for Israel. Dangerous more, and in terms of the security interest, it would be right for Israel not to allow Iran to have a bomb, and even at the price of using military force. But we still have time before we have to reach that decision, and we should exhaust and give a chance to everyone who is involved in this matter. Amos Yadlin had a slide in his presentation that maybe we'll see again later. What's a good agreement, what's a bad agreement, and we have spoken of this before, and I would recommend Israeli policymakers to dwell on the matter of an agreement, because for the first time, and I think that's a new thing, I see an interest both on the American side and the Iranian side to reach some sort of accord or agreement. On the American side, it is comfortable to reach a deal also from the American perspective, and for the Iranians, as Amos Yadlin correctly analyzed, despite of the crisis, they want to reach an agreement, some sort of an accord that will help them not to lose face. And therefore we have to be very careful that we not reach a deal or strike a deal that at the end of which we are in a situation where it seems that we are in a reasonable situation. Maybe the sanctions will be lifted or lightened, and this lever that is currently being imposed, I think that once the additional sanctions are added in the next few months, I don't think that there will be the right deal. Thank you very much.